Italy might equip Ukraine with its own Iron Dome. Ukraine doesn't necessarily need a ton of more diverse air defenses, it just needs its air defenses to stop acting like a group project from 4 different countries that all hate each other. And weirdly enough, Italy might have the answer. Hey friends, Wes O'Donnell here, multi-branch US veteran and such a big fan of Italy that I married an Italian woman, and trust me, her family loves it when I walk into the door at Thanksgiving and say, "It's me, Mario." That never gets old. Ukraine doesn't have one air defense problem, it has 3, stacked right on top of each other, like the leaning tower of Jenga during an air raid. First, Russia keeps throwing mass at the system. Drones, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, decoys, weird timing, ugly sequencing, and enough nightly volume to turn even a respectable air defense network into a math problem with sirens. Second, interceptors are finite. Now that sounds obvious, but a lot of people still talk about Patriot batteries like they're vending machines. They're not. You don't just slap the side and another PAC-3 falls out. And third, and this is the one that matters most, Ukraine's air defense network is still a patchwork. It's a very smart patchwork. It's a very brave patchwork. Sometimes a brilliantly improvised patchwork, but it's still a patchwork. And this is where Italy's Michelangelo system comes in. And before you ask, yes, I also find it funny that one of the most important future air defense systems in Europe is named after a Renaissance artist or a Ninja Turtle, the party dude. Nothing says anti-ballistic missile architecture like the Sistine Chapel. So let's start with the actual problem. Ukraine's traditional air defense picture is a Frankenstein stack of Soviet S-300s, American Patriots, Norwegian NASAMS, German Iris-Ts, and various local software workarounds duct taped together under battlefield pressure. Now, those systems were designed by different countries for different doctrines, using different sensors, different missiles, different communications protocols, and different assumptions about who they'd be fighting and how. They do not naturally talk to each other, so Ukrainian operators are effectively running multiple different air defense systems at the same time while trying to build one unified picture of what's coming, from where, at what speed, and which launcher should kill it. That's hard enough to do on a quiet day. Now, Russia being Russia figured out how to exploit this. Moscow starts a raid with cheap Shahed drones. The point is not only to hit something, the point is to force Ukraine to burn attention and time and expensive interceptors against cheap incoming junk. Then, once the defenders are tired, once the stocks are lower, once everyone's nerves are frayed and the engagement geometry is uglier, the real payload comes behind it. Ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, the expensive stuff. And that tactic has been working, not because Ukraine is incompetent, quite the opposite. Ukraine has become very good at squeezing performance out of a messy architecture. The issue is structural. Even a good patchwork is still a patchwork when the enemy understands the seams. So the real missing piece is not only more launchers, it's a conductor. And that brings us to Michelangelo. Now, Leonardo, the Italian defense company, is building less like another missile battery and more like a European air defense brain. The key point here is that Michelangelo is not being sold as Italy's answer to Iron Dome. It's not one launcher, one radar, one missile, one flag, problem solved. It's a network architecture, a system designed to tie radars, sensors, command software, and multiple air defense weapons into one common picture so the whole network can see more, react faster, and assign the right shooter to the right threat before the math gets ugly. Leonardo's CEO Roberto Cingolani said in March that the first component of Michelangelo is currently being built for Ukraine, and that testing is planned by the end of this year. Then he added very helpfully that this first test would be there in Ukraine, in a real environment, and that nobody should ask more, which honestly is one of the more charming European ways to say, yes, we're doing something serious, and no, I'm not going to hand you the schematics over espresso. That sentence tells us 2 things. First, whatever Ukraine is getting is sensitive enough that Leonardo doesn't want to describe it in detail in public yet. Second, Leonardo understands that the Ukrainian battlefield is the hardest air defense test range on Earth, and they're right. No NATO exercise can reproduce what Ukraine is dealing with. No training range throws thousands of drones and missiles at you every month while the enemy studies last week's interception patterns and tweaks the next wave accordingly. If it works in Ukraine, it works anywhere. So what is the actual core of this thing? Well, it's called MC5, Multi-Domain Command Control Communications, Computers, and Cyber, which is a wonderfully military way of saying We built the brain that keeps all the other stuff from acting stupid. Think of MC5 as the conductor of an orchestra where every musician showed up from a different country with a different instrument, playing different sheet music. That is Ukraine's air defense problem right now. MC5 is supposed to fuse sensor data from Patriots, NASAMS, Iris-T, S-300s, whatever Frank and Sam Ukraine wants, into one unified air picture. Then, using AI-assisted threat analysis, it can help assign the right interceptor or the shooter to the right incoming threat. That matters a lot right now because those decisions require human coordination across multiple systems and chains. Human coordination is noble. Human coordination is admirable. Human coordination also takes time, and against a ballistic missile in terminal flight, time is exactly what you don't have. Now, Michelangelo's promise is not that it magically invents more interceptors. Its promise is that it stops Ukraine from wasting the wrong interceptor on the wrong threat. That is a huge difference because the ideal answer to a Shahed drone is not a Patriot missile. The ideal answer is something much cheaper, much faster to replenish, and much less painful to lose. Save the premium rounds for the premium threats. Use the lower layer for the cheap junk. Keep the network coherent so Russia can't drain your expensive magazines with disposable noise before the real strike package arrives. That's the theory. And the specific piece reportedly heading to Ukraine this year is expected to focus on the counter-drone layer, the part Leonardo calls the dead zone segment. That layer is designed for low-flying drones and swarm attacks using advanced gun systems with guided munitions, which means Ukraine is not getting the full Sistine Chapel ceiling this year. Unfortunately, it's getting the first coat of paint. And in fairness, that first coat is useful. Ukraine already performs relatively well against drones compared with its ballistic missile numbers, but that does not mean the drone layer doesn't matter. Drones are still what starts the whole Russian sequencing trick. If you improve the cheap threat layer, you make the expensive threat layer easier to protect later. That is attrition management, and attrition management is, unfortunately, the entire war. There's also a much bigger long-term play here. Leonardo's plan is not just sell Ukraine a gadget and see what happens. The broader Michelangelo architecture is supposed to mature through NATO trials in 2027, then expand with Space Guardian, Leonardo's own satellite constellation, in 2028 and 2029. The idea is sovereign European space base ISR feeding a European air defense network that can eventually plug into NATO and EU frameworks by 2030. This is another step that the EU is taking to slowly move away from dependence on the United States, and I think it's a smart move right now. It's also enormously ambitious. If you're watching Patriot interceptors get vacuumed toward the Middle East while Ukraine is still under bombardment, you start thinking very hard about sovereign alternatives, and Ukraine gets the first piece before NATO gets the full trials. That sequencing tells you exactly where Leonardo believes the urgent problem is. Now, there is a really important comparison here, and it hurts because it's true. Look at Israel's intercept rates during major missile exchanges with Iran and Hamas. Multi-layer defense, multiple interceptor families, a nationally coherent architecture where every layer knows what the other layer is doing. Now, Michelangelo, or more specifically, the MC5 piece of it, is an attempt to close that architecture gap. Not by replacing everything Ukraine already has, but just by connecting it. That is the more important distinction. Ukraine does not lack operators. Ukraine does not lack courage. Ukraine does not even lack systems entirely. What it has been missing is the conductor. So the component heading to Ukraine this year is not the full answer to the ballistic missile problem. It's not the whole MC5 dream. It's not the full integrated architecture that stops Russia's layered sequencing from draining one part of the network before the real killers arrive. That fuller promise is what NATO trials in 2027 are supposed to validate. Ukraine needs that now. What it gets now, though, is a counter-drone improvement. It's useful, yes. Transformative, not yet. And that gap matters because that gap between genuinely useful and strategically transformative is measured in years. Ukraine is living inside that gap right now, where ballistic missiles keep arriving, and while other theaters keep competing for the same premium interceptors. That is the tragedy here. Michelangelo may be the right answer. Ukraine just doesn't have the luxury of waiting for the full version to show up on schedule. Anyways, where does that leave us? Well, Italy may actually have one of the most intelligent answers yet to Ukraine's air defense problem, not because it's shipping some magic anti-missile wand, but because it understands the real problem is architecture. Ukraine's defenders don't necessarily need more missiles, well, they do, But they need the system to think faster, see more clearly, and stop burning premium interceptors on disposable threats while Russia laughs and lines up the next wave. Michelangelo is one serious attempt to fix that. The peace arriving this year is real. It should help. And the full architecture, if it eventually works the way Leonardo claims, could be genuinely transformative, not only for Ukraine, but for European air defense more broadly. And here's the cruel irony. Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel in about 4 years. Ukraine does not have 4 years. It needs the ceiling painted now. That's it for today, my friends. Subscribing is the best free way to help me push back on Russian disinformation. Maybe you buy the Leonardo system, we come over there and start breaking some things, eh? Hey, forget about it, Fat Tony, bada bing. And as always, glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes. Crimea is Ukraine.